When Johnny comes marching home again, hurrah, hurrah, we'll give him a hearty welcome then, hurrah, hurrah. The men will cheer and the boys will shout, the ladies, they will all turn out and we'll all feel gay when Johnny comes marching home. The old church bell will peal with joy, hurrah, hurrah, to welcome home our darling boy, hurrah, hurrah. The village lads and lassies say with roses they will strew their way and we'll all feel gay when Johnny comes marching home. When Johnny comes marching home again, hurrah, hurrah, we'll give him a...
American Civil War took place from 1861 to 1865. The Union produced a lot of industrial issues, such as businesses and corporations that exploited raw materials, while the Confederates kept on farming. That is the reason because it's considered that the Union won the war, but it doesn't have any winners or losers, because it was a civil war as a country. Nevertheless, this led to the American industrialization.
Welcome home our darling boy, hurrah, hurrah. The village lads and lassies say with roses they will strew their way and we'll all feel gay when Johnny comes marching home. When Johnny comes marching home again, hurrah, hurrah, we'll give him a hearty welcome then, hurrah, hurrah. The men will cheer and the boys will shout, the ladies they will all turn out and we'll all feel gay when Johnny comes marching home. The old church bell will peal with joy, hurrah, hurrah, to welcome home our darling boy, hurrah, hurrah. The village lads and lassies say with roses they will strew their way and we'll all feel gay when Johnny comes marching home. When Johnny comes marching home again, hurrah, hurrah, we'll give him a hearty welcome then, hurrah, hurrah. The men will cheer and the boys will shout, the ladies they will all turn out and we'll all feel gay when Johnny comes marching home again, hurrah, hurrah, we'll give him a hearty welcome then, hurrah, hurrah. The men will cheer and the boys will shout, the ladies they will all turn out and we'll all feel gay when Johnny comes marching home.
American industrialization took a much higher scale than it did in Europe, allowed the country to become a world potency in terms of economic matters. Rapid industrial growth in America and expansion changed from agrarian way of life to urban existence. During the process of urbanization, many events took place. The invention of the steam engine freed the factory from a rural source of water power and allowed it to come into the city. Economy moved from a landed to a commercial or industrial world. Rapid growth of cities increased diversity in the nation. Farmers, Native Americans, freed slaves, Chinese and European immigrants all faced problems. There was a rise of corporate businesses. The influx of immigrants expanding the population. Strikes emerged to improve working conditions. The imperialism of United States started with the Western expansion, the building of the transcontinental railroads, and the closing of the frontier. To illustrate the speed and magnitude of change, it is important to mention that New York had grown from a city of 500,000 in 1850 to a metropolis of nearly 3,500,000 inhabitants by 1900. Chicago, at mid-century, a raw town of 20,000, had over 2 million inhabitants by 1910. In 1880, 80% of the New York population were foreigners.
You know a hobo, hobo a long, long way from home. Oh yeah.
Because of the expansion of the urban centers, there was a phenomenon that was the poverty and also the creation of new social status, lower, middle, and upper classes. Two classes that benefit from it were middle and upper classes. These two classes were composed of people that had wealth and success. The middle class was composed of businessmen and other professionals. In contrast with the middle and upper classes, the working class was not well off. In the working class, many were replacing factories by machines. But on the other hand, many also gained new jobs in factories working with machinery. Other problems were urban slums, farm struggles, labor unrest, conflicts in the West, and a struggle for freedom, especially immigrants, women, and African Americans.
You know you travel like a blue hand.
Realism is a very real description of what the reality is, and is also known as verisimilitude. And it began around the start of the Civil War. In the literary movement, people wanted to read stories that they could relate it to, rather than unrealistic stories framed in the Romanticism, and the language was simple and easy to get for all the audiences. Realism highlighted the issues concerned to middle class. Characters were usually based around factual events, and people intended to reflect a truthful representation of reality. The roots of American realism are, first, the experience in war caused little interest in imaginative or romantic literature. Second, frontier life caused conflicts with Native Americans, the hardships of pioneer life. Finally, the urban experience caused cities with poverty, slums, and crime.
You know
Regionalism or local color sought to capture the essence of life in the various regions of the country, such as regional dialect, landscape, customs, and beliefs. The writing during this period was also very regional. America was leaping into a new modern age, and people feared that local folkways and traditions would be soon forgotten. America was shifting into higher gear, and readers wanted writers who clearly communicated the complexities of their human experiences.
my mother followed me down to the freight train.
Naturalism suggests that lives and events are decided by forces beyond our control. Forces such as environment, heredity, and chance determines one's destiny. Determinism tells us about violence, man against nature, man against himself. Other relevant aspects are nature is an indifferent force acting on the lives of human beings. Characters are often poorly educated, lower class, controlled by forces of heredity, animalistic instinct, raw passion, no free will or choice. Why did naturalism develop? The swell of immigrants in the later half of the 19th century, which led to a larger lower class and increased poverty in the cities. The prominence of psychology and theories of Sigmund Freud. Pessimism in the wake of the Civil War and Reconstruction. Publication of Charles Darwin's Origin of the Species. The influence of French realism changed the relationship between literature and society. Novel had the power to become a political weapon. In literature, realism gives us a picture of life as it really is. Stories of realism deal with everyday problems that most people encounter. Sometimes the characters overcome their problems, other times they don't.
You know a hobo a long, long way from home. Oh yeah. Yes, I did. Long time ago. I left home that morning. My mother followed me down to that freight train yard. She said, my son, he's gone. Take care of my child. Lord knows he's trying. You know he traveling through the land. You know he traveling. You know he traveling through the land.
Lost Generation. Those writers received this nickname, Lost Generation, not only because of the situation that they were living, but also because of the amount of people who died. The World War I began in 1914 and ended in 1918. It was the mother of all wars, that in the World War I the death was everywhere because of the constant bombing and the mustard gas. This gas burns the throats of its victims and causes death by asphyxiation. Why the World War I was inevitable? First, on June 28, 1914, Archduke Francis Ferdinand of Austria was murdered. Second, on July 5, 1914, Germany issues with Austria-Hungary called the Blank Check. It was an infamous episode in the history of the First World War. In fact, it was the first truly fatal error made by Germany, a promise of unconditional support for whatever action Austria-Hungary might take to punish Serbia. Finally, on July 23, 1914, Austria sent to Serbia an ultimatum. The ultimatum was presented by the Austrian government to Belgrade on Thursday, 23 July 1914 at 6 p.m. The text of the ultimatum asked the Serbians to concede all demands made by the Austro-Hungarians. It includes one or two minor clauses. Shortly after the ultimatum, on July 28, 1914, war was declared by Austria-Hungary on Serbia. After that, on July 29, 1914, Russia began full mobilization of its troops. Then, on August 1, 1914, Germany declared war on Russia. And on August 2, 1914, Germany demanded Belgium declare access to German troops. The long-term causes of the World War I were the following ones. First, nationalism that was a devotion to the interests and culture of one's nation. Second, imperialism, that was an economic and political control over weaker nations. Third, militarism helped to the growth of nationalism and imperialism, which led to increased military spending. Finally, by 1907, Europe was divided into two armed camps. The Central Powers conformed by Germany, Austria-Hungary, Italy, and Turkey, and the Allied Powers conformed by Russia, France, Great Britain, and United States. United States' involvement in World War I was hastened by the Lusitania disaster. The Lusitania was a British passenger liner that carried 1,198 people on a fateful trip on May 7, 1915. That fateful day, a German U-boat sank the British passenger liner, killing all aboard, including 128 American tourists. Germans claimed the ship was carrying Allied ammunition. Due to this, Americans were outraged and public opinion turned against Germany and the Central Powers. So, Americans went to war. The United States presidential election of 1916 took place while Europe was embroiled in World War I. Public feeling in the still neutral United States leaned toward the British and French forces, due to the harsh treatment of civilians by the German army. However, despite their sympathy with the Allied forces, most American voters wanted to avoid involvement in the war and preferred to continue a policy of neutrality. After a hard-fought contest, Wilson defeated Hughes by a narrow margin. Wilson was held by his campaign slogan, "He kept us out of war." But that slogan was ironic because within a few months, the United States would be embroiled in World War I. The Great Depression was a worldwide economic depression that lasted 10 years. Its kick-off was Black Thursday, October 24, 1929. That's when traders sold 12.9 million shares of stock in one day. It was triple the usual amount. Over the next 4 days, stock prices fell 23%. That's called the stock market crash of 1929. The depression had devastating effects in the U.S. First, many farmers lost their farms. Thousands of these farmers and other unemployed workers looked for work in California. Many ended up living as homeless and others moved to shanty towns. And second, crimes and criminals. Crime was not just big-name gangsters like Al Capone and Dutch Schultz. It was also the local neighborhood gangs robbing houses and convenience stores. The Spanish Civil War began in 1936 and ended in 1939. It was an armed conflict between the Republicans and Nationalists, led by General Francisco Franco. When an initial military coup failed to win control of the entire country, a bloody civil war ensued, fought with the great ferocity on both sides. The Nationalists received aid from Fascist Italy and Nazi Germany. The Republicans received aid from the Soviet Union as well as from volunteers from Europe and the United States. World War II began in 1939 and ended in 1945. Although the war began with Nazi Germany's attack on Poland in September 1939, the United States didn't enter the war until the Japanese army bombed the American fleet in Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. Between those two events, President Franklin Roosevelt worked hard to prepare Americans for a conflict that he regarded as inevitable. In November 1939, he persuaded Congress to repeal the arms embargo provisions of the neutrality law so that arms could be sold to France and Britain. Some effects that World War II brought. First, the domestic wartime policies of U.S. in which Roosevelt established World Production Board, redirecting production of civilian consumer goods to war material. Second, revenue for funding the war was generated through withholding income tax from paychecks and selling war bonds. Third, the government began rationing resources such as stars and food items. Finally, mobilization in the U.S. Their war effort required all of America's huge productive capacity and full employment of the workforce. And U.S. budget increased from $9 million by 1940 to $100 million by 1944. Expenditures in World War II were greater than in all previous government budgets combined. The home front of the United States in World War II supported the war effort in many ways, including a wide range of volunteer efforts and submitting to government-managed rationing and price controls. The World War II ended with the Great Depression. Factories were run at full capacity. Ford Motor Company built one bomber plane per hour. People started saving money. Also, army bases in South provide economic and the national debt grew to $260 billion. Existentialism is a term applied to the work of certain late 19th and 20th century philosophers who shared the belief that philosophical thinking begins with the human subject, not merely the thinking subject, but the acting, feeling, living human individual. In existentialism, the individual's starting point is characterized by what has been called the existential attitude, or a sense of disorientation and confusion in the face of an apparently meaningless or absurd world. Other literary movement was absurdism. It is the belief that a search for meaning is inherently in conflict with the actual lack of meaning, but that one should both accept this and simultaneously rebel against it by embracing what life has to offer. Absurdists believe that it is futile to examine the meaning of life because life is random, and looking for it is a waste of time. An absurd man only wants to live with what he can be sure of. The Black Arts Movement were social and political forces in the black community in the 1960s and 1970s, so to change the way African Americans were defined and treated. It also sought to change how blacks were represented and portrayed in literature and arts. In the contemporary scene, African American writers have entered into the mainstream of American readership and have published in many genres like romance, mystery, science fiction, and literary fiction. While issues of identity and race are still prominent, the range of human issues are also topics of contemporary African American literature. The Harlem Renaissance was the artistic and socio-cultural awakening of African Americans in the 1920s and 1930s. It was centered around the vibrant African American community in Harlem, New York, but had far-reaching influence in the art, music, literature, and social thought. In the 1940s and 1960s was an era of social change for African Americans. Influences included the Second World War, the Second Great Migration, worldwide social movements such as communism and Marxism, and early civil rights legislation which opened up schools and jobs for many African Americans. In the 1970s, African American literature began to enter the mainstream of publishing and be read by black and white audiences. Also, African American literature began to be defined and analyzed, and black women began to achieve success as novelists, poets, writers, and artists. Martin Luther King Jr. was a Baptist minister and social activist who led the civil rights movement in the United States. Among his many efforts, King headed the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Through his activism and inspirational speeches, he played an essential role in ending the legal segregation of African American citizens in the United States, as well as the creation of the Civil Rights Act in 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. King received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964. The NAACP was founded in 1909 by a group of multiracial activists. It was originally called the National Negro Committee.
One of these mornings you're going to rise up singing. Your wings and you take the sky, but till that morning there's nothing can harm you.
Our problem was then is the second-class citizenship that we were experiencing. We couldn't go to the restaurants, we couldn't go to the theaters, and so we're saying, hey, we've got to do something about this, and the NAACP became a brain trust to get out of this, to relieve us of the oppressed condition under which we were living.
You're going to rise up singing, then you spread your wings and you take the sky.
The first writings by blacks in America were autobiographical and became known as the slave narrative. Slave narrative, also called the freedom narrative or the liberation narrative, is also an essential part of the anti-slavery movement. These narratives drew on biblical allusion and imagery, the rhetoric of abolitionism, the traditions of the captivity narrative, and the spiritual autobiography in appealing to their audiences. Some of these narratives bore a frame or preface attesting to their authenticity and to the sufferings described within. Three themes were developed in early African American writers around the issue of slavery: accommodation, protest, and escape.
The colors of the rainbow, so pretty in the sky, are also on the faces of people going by. I see friends shaking hands, saying, "How do you do?" They're really saying, "I love you." I hear babies cry, I watch them grow. They're like much more than I'll ever know. And I think to myself, what a wonderful world. Yes, I think to myself, what a wonderful world. Oh, yeah. Blessed day, the dogs say goodnight, and I think to myself, what a wonderful world. The colors of the rainbow, so pretty in the sky.